What if the greatest struggle of the Second World War was not fought with guns, but with pride? Imagine American generals, exhausted by battle and responsibility, suddenly realizing that the fiercest opposition was not from Hitler's armies, but from across the conference table. Imagine the frustration of watching young Americans bleed and die in Tunisia, Sicily, Normandy, and the Ardennes, only to have their sacrifices dismissed as supporting roles in someone else's glory. Imagine being told again and again that your courage was real, but your judgment was not. This is the paradox hidden within the story of World War II, a coalition united against tyranny, yet divided by personality, politics, and pride. At the center of it all stood Bernard Law Montgomery, a field marshal adored in Britain, but increasingly despised by his American allies. He was brilliant, methodical, and cautious, yet his inability to treat Americans as equals nearly tore the alliance apart. Today, we will walk through those defining moments, from Tunisia's desert winds to the snowbound forests of the Ardennes, from Operation Husky to Market Garden. We will uncover how unity was tested and how respect proved harder to win than any battlefield. The winter winds of North Africa carried with them more than sand. They carried humiliation. In February of 1943, at a place called Kasserine Pass, the United States Army met the German Wehrmacht head-on for the first time. It was a disaster. Tanks burned in the valley, smoke choked the sky, and shattered American units retreated in confusion. To German eyes, the Americans seemed like untested children thrown into the crucible of war. To British commanders, the defeat confirmed something darker, that American troops were not ready, and perhaps never would be. Reports from British headquarters painted a devastating picture. General Sir Harold Alexander, overseeing Allied ground forces in Tunisia, wrote evaluations that dripped with condescension. American troops, he claimed, lacked discipline. Their commanders were inexperienced. Their units required extensive British oversight before they could be trusted with significant responsibilities. For many American officers reading those words, the insult cut deeper than the bullets at Kasserine. They were not just fighting Germans, they were fighting for dignity in the eyes of their own allies. Into this storm stepped Lieutenant General George S. Patton. On March 6, 1943, he assumed command of the battered Second Corps. He arrived in Tunisia like a man entering the arena, determined to transform humiliation into redemption. His diary entries revealed his fury at British presumption. He noted how British officers viewed Americans as auxiliaries, useful for manpower, but not worthy of independent responsibility. To Patton, this was intolerable. The United States had not entered the war to play second fiddle. Patton's solution was simple and brutal: prove American worth through victory. He reorganized the Second Corps with ruthless efficiency. Officers would lead from the front. Troops would adopt strict discipline. Every battle would be an opportunity to show the world that American arms were equal to any in the alliance. His words carried the fire of conviction. We are not here to guard supply depots. We are here to kill the enemy. The opportunity came at El Guettar. On March 23rd, German tanks of the 10th Panzer Division rolled into the valley, confident they would scatter American lines as they had at Kasserine. But this time, they faced an army reborn. American artillery had been carefully positioned, overlapping in deadly fields of fire. Anti-tank guns and tank destroyers were concealed in the rugged terrain, waiting for their prey. As the first German armor advanced, the valley erupted. Shell after shell smashed into the panzer columns. Fires lit the sky as steel was torn apart. By day's end, the impossible had happened. The Americans had held. More than 50 German tanks lay destroyed or crippled on the field. For the first time in the war, American soldiers had beaten seasoned German armor in a stand-up fight. The triumph at El Guettar was more than a tactical victory. It was a declaration. Yet the declaration went largely unheard. In British headquarters, the reports still spoke the language of superiority. Montgomery's 8th Army was praised for its grinding advance against the Mareth Line, while Patton's victory was treated as little more than a supporting act. American newspapers received only fragments of the story, while British communiques highlighted their own operations. At the Tunis Victory Parade in May 1943, Eisenhower, Alexander, and French General Henri Giraud took the salute. The narrative emphasized British glory. American contributions were mentioned in passing, like a footnote in someone else's book. For Patton and for the men of the Second Corps, the lesson was bitter. It was not enough to fight well. They had to fight twice, once against the Germans and once for recognition. Behind closed doors, Patton fumed at Montgomery's arrogance, describing him as a man unwilling to admit that the balance of power in the alliance had shifted. Bradley, more reserved but no less determined, noted how every decision seemed designed to keep Americans subordinate. Still, the soldiers knew. The victory at El Guettar had changed them. They had walked into battle as green troops still haunted by Kasserine. They emerged as veterans who had faced the best Germany had to offer and held the line. The Americans had proven that their courage was not in question. What remained was to prove that their leadership deserved respect. This was only the beginning. Tunisia planted the seeds of resentment that would grow through Sicily, Normandy, and the Ardennes. It was here, in the deserts of North Africa, that American commanders realized they were fighting not just for victory, but for equality within the alliance. And as the war moved on to the shores of Sicily, those seeds would bear fruit in ways that Montgomery could neither ignore nor dismiss. The waves of the Mediterranean crashed against the landing craft as dawn broke on July 10, 1943. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, had begun. More than 8 divisions of American and British troops stormed the beaches under heavy fire. For many soldiers, it felt like Normandy before Normandy, a massive amphibious assault that would test not only the Allies' strength against German and Italian defenders, but also the fragile partnership holding the coalition together. The plan for Husky had been contentious from the start. American strategists favored broad landings across the island to seize multiple ports and secure supply lines. But Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery detested scattered assaults. His doctrine was clear: concentrate power, strike decisively, and avoid dispersal at all costs. Backed by Winston Churchill, Montgomery pressed his case with characteristic bluntness. By the time final orders were issued, the landings were concentrated in the southeastern corner of Sicily. Montgomery's 8th Army would drive straight for Messina, the gateway to mainland Italy. The American 7th Army, under General George S. Patton, would secure the left flank. To Patton, the implications were insulting. Once again, American forces were relegated to a supporting role, while British troops were assigned the decisive mission. His diary seethed with frustration. "We are nothing but guards," he wrote, condemning the arrangement as a deliberate attempt to sideline American achievement. The landings themselves were bloody but successful. At Gela, Patton's forces faced determined German counterattacks, including waves of tanks. American infantry and naval gunfire held them off in desperate fighting that cost hundreds of lives. The beaches were secured, but the scars were deep. Meanwhile, Montgomery advanced along the eastern coast, confident that his cautious, methodical approach would soon crush Axis resistance. Reality proved less forgiving. German paratroopers and armored divisions fought ferociously around Catania, turning narrow roads and mountain passes into killing zones. Montgomery's advance bogged down, his timetable slipping with each passing day. And then came the signal that would ignite one of the most famous rivalries of World War II. Montgomery proposed expanding his operational area westward, effectively commandeering roads and territory originally assigned to the American 7th Army. His message carried not a request, but an assumption. Americans would halt while the British pushed forward. Alexander, the British commander overseeing Mediterranean operations, agreed without hesitation. Patton's rage boiled over. To him, the order was more than military adjustment. It was another slap in the face, another reminder that British commanders viewed Americans as junior partners. Officially, Patton complied. Unofficially, he refused to sit idle. On July 17th, he flew to headquarters with his own proposal. The 7th Army would advance northwest toward Palermo, Sicily's capital. The move would trap Italian forces, secure vital ports, and most importantly, demonstrate American initiative. Alexander approved, perhaps hoping to redirect Patton's aggression away from Montgomery's front. What followed was a campaign of speed and audacity. Patton drove his divisions across rugged terrain at a pace that stunned friend and foe alike. Within 12 days of landing, American troops marched into Palermo, greeted by cheering civilians. Photographs of Patton riding triumphantly through the city filled newspapers across the United States. For the first time, American forces had seized a major European city on their own, without British direction. The race was on. From Palermo, Patton turned his army eastward along the northern coast. His goal was clear: reach Messina before Montgomery. The drive became a contest of pride as much as strategy. American infantry slogged through heat and dust. Engineers rebuilt shattered bridges overnight, and armored columns pushed relentlessly forward. Patton's men covered ground at astonishing speed, often moving faster than supplies could keep up. Montgomery, meanwhile, continued his deliberate push from the south, hammering German defenses with artillery and infantry assaults. His progress was steady, but slow. The contrast could not have been sharper. The British commander, cautious and methodical, grinding against strong resistance. The American general, aggressive and daring, racing across the island with momentum as his weapon. By mid-August, the outcome was inevitable. On August 17, 1943, elements of the American 3rd Infantry Division entered Messina just hours before British troops arrived. Patton had won the race. The symbolism was profound. For the first time, the Americans had not merely participated, they had outpaced, outmaneuvered, and outshone their British counterparts. But the victory was bittersweet. In official communiques, British reporting downplayed the American achievement, emphasizing the difficulty of the Eighth Army's battles and dismissing the Seventh Army's triumph as a secondary effort. British newspapers celebrated Montgomery, while American successes received cursory acknowledgement. For American commanders, the pattern was infuriating. No matter how much they achieved, recognition was denied. Bradley, usually the calm diplomat, admitted his frustration. Our victories are footnotes, theirs are headlines. Patton, never one to hide his emotions, fumed openly, describing Montgomery as arrogant and condescending. The clash of personalities had become more than professional rivalry. It was a battle for national pride. And, yet, for the soldiers who had marched through Sicily's mountains, who had faced German tanks and blistering heat, the victory was undeniable. They had proven that the American army was not a supporting force. It was a spearhead, capable of independent triumph. Sicily marked the moment when the United States began to see itself not just as an ally, but as a leader. The seeds of resentment sown in Tunisia had blossomed into full rivalry on the rocky shores of Sicily. And as the Allies prepared for the next great challenge, the invasion of France, those divisions would grow deeper. The Americans had shown they could lead, but the question remained, would the British ever accept them as equals? On June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy erupted in fire. Operation Overlord, the long-awaited invasion of France, had begun. Waves of American, British, and Canadian troops stormed the coast under withering German fire. By nightfall, the Allies had secured their foothold in Western Europe. For the world, D-Day was a triumph of unity. For those inside the Allied command, it was also the beginning of another battle. One fought not against Germany, but within the alliance itself. At the heart of that struggle was Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. During the invasion itself, he had commanded all Allied ground forces, a responsibility that gave him enormous influence. His planning, meticulous and cautious, had shaped the landings and ensured coordination between British and American troops. To his supporters, this was proof of his genius. To many American commanders, however, it was yet another reminder that Montgomery saw himself not as a partner, but as the rightful leader of the entire Allied war effort. The problem grew worse in September. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, formally assumed personal command of all Allied ground operations. Montgomery, who had briefly enjoyed the authority of overall commander, was reduced to leading only the British and Canadian 21st Army Group. For him, it was a humiliation he could neither forgive nor forget. He believed Eisenhower, though gifted in politics and diplomacy, lacked the battlefield experience necessary for decisive command. In Montgomery's view, only he possessed the skill to deliver final victory. The strategic debate that followed revealed the rift. Eisenhower favored a broad front advance, multiple armies pushing into Germany along a wide axis, maintaining pressure everywhere and denying the enemy the chance to regroup. Montgomery denounced the plan as wasteful and indecisive. He demanded concentration of force in a single, powerful thrust into northern Germany, an operation he, of course, would lead. With supplies and manpower channeled into his offensive, Montgomery promised to end the war by Christmas. Eisenhower, balancing coalition politics with military necessity, compromised. He would not abandon the broad front, but he did grant Montgomery priority in resources for a daring operation into the Netherlands. It would be called Operation Market Garden. The plan was breathtaking in ambition. 3 airborne divisions, 2 American and 1 British, would drop behind enemy lines to seize key bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. Meanwhile, British ground forces would drive north along a single highway, link up with the paratroopers, and cross the Rhine into Germany. If it worked, the war might indeed end quickly. But even before the operation began, doubts filled American headquarters. Bradley and Patton both questioned the risks. The single road was vulnerable. The airborne landings were dangerously far from their objectives. Intelligence reported German armored units in the area, but these warnings were brushed aside. Montgomery, brimming with confidence, insisted on the attack. On September the 17th, 1944, the skies filled with parachutes. 35,000 men dropped into the Netherlands, one of the largest airborne assaults in history. At first, the plan seemed to work. Bridges at Eindhoven and Nijmegen fell into Allied hands. But at Arnhem, the northernmost objective, the British 1st Airborne Division faced disaster. German tanks and infantry counterattacked with ferocity. Cut off and outnumbered, the paratroopers fought bravely but could not hold. Meanwhile, the British ground column, advancing along the narrow highway, stalled under constant German attacks. Destroyed bridges and ambushes turned the road into what soldiers grimly called Hell's Highway. The timetable collapsed. Relief never reached Arnhem. After 9 days of brutal combat, the survivors of the 1st Airborne withdrew, leaving thousands dead or captured. Market Garden was a failure, costly, avoidable, and devastating. More than 17,000 Allied soldiers were casualties. The Rhine remained uncrossed. The dream of ending the war in 1944 evaporated. For American commanders, the verdict was clear. Montgomery's arrogance had led to disaster. Patton raged when he learned that fuel and supplies had been diverted from his own army to support Market Garden. Bradley, usually restrained, accused Montgomery of gambling with lives for the sake of personal glory. But the true insult came afterward. In his public statements, Montgomery declared Market Garden a 90% success. He emphasized the bridges taken and the territory gained, while dismissing the failure at Arnhem, the very heart of the operation, as a minor detail. To Eisenhower's staff, the claim was breathtaking in its dishonesty. 17,000 casualties for no strategic gain, yet Montgomery called it a victory. For Americans, this was more than vanity. It was betrayal. They had shed blood to support the plan, had warned of its flaws, and had watched as it collapsed. Now they were asked to accept that the failure was, in Montgomery's words, 90% success. Bradley wrote bitterly that the field marshal would never admit error, that every defeat would be blamed on others, every triumph claimed as his own. Patton dismissed him as insufferable, declaring that Montgomery's caution and arrogance wasted both time and lives. Normandy had been a victory of unity. Market Garden became a symbol of division. It showed that even in the midst of World War II, the alliance could fracture under the weight of pride and ambition. And the rift was far from over. The winter of 1944 would bring the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great gamble, and with it, the moment when Montgomery's arrogance would ignite a crisis that nearly tore the alliance apart once and for all. The forests of the Ardennes lay silent under a blanket of snow on the morning of December the 16th, 1944. Then the silence shattered. German artillery thundered across the frozen hills, tanks surged through narrow valleys, and infantry swarmed into thinly held American positions. Adolf Hitler had launched his final gamble in the West, a desperate offensive aimed at splitting the Allied armies and seizing Antwerp. The Americans called it the Battle of the Bulge. Caught off guard, U.S. divisions fell back under the crushing assault. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles, villages went up in flames, and prisoners marched into captivity. In Washington, fear spread that the German Reich might prolong the war for another year. In the chaos, General Dwight D. Eisenhower made a fateful decision. He transferred temporary command of the American 1st and 9th Armies to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. On December 20th, Montgomery assumed authority over two battered American armies north of the German advance. To his credit, his actions were swift and professional. He stabilized the front, coordinated reserves, and deployed British units to guard the Meuse River crossings. Under his direction, defensive lines stiffened. German spearheads slowed, then faltered. For a brief moment, Montgomery was exactly what his reputation promised: calm, methodical, and effective. But victories are not only measured on the battlefield, they are also measured in words. And it was words, not bullets, that turned Montgomery's role in the Ardennes into a lasting wound between the Allies. By January, German forces were in retreat. The crisis had passed. On January 7, 1945, Montgomery held a press conference to describe the battle. At first, he struck the right tone. He praised the courage of American soldiers, lauding their determination under impossible conditions. But soon, the compliments turned into something else, a carefully crafted narrative that placed Montgomery at the center of victory. "As soon as I saw what was happening," he declared, "I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans got to the Meuse, they would not get over that river." He described how he had tidied up the battlefield and imposed order on the chaos, and he spoke of his foresight, his balance, his clarity. The implication was unmistakable. American soldiers had fought bravely, but without Montgomery's guiding hand, disaster would have been inevitable. For the men who had actually borne the brunt of the battle, the words were a dagger. It was the American 101st Airborne Division that had held Bastogne under siege. It was Patton's Third Army that had pivoted 90 degrees in winter conditions and smashed through snow and ice to relieve the surrounded troops. It was American blood that had stopped Hitler's last gamble. Yet, in Montgomery's telling, his intervention had saved the day. The reaction in American headquarters was explosive. General Omar Bradley read the reports with fury. His normally calm demeanor shattered. He told Eisenhower bluntly that he could not serve under Montgomery. If Eisenhower intended to give the British Field Marshal permanent command of American forces, Bradley would resign. For a man of Bradley's composure, the threat was extraordinary, and it showed just how deep the insult cut. Patton's rage was even more volcanic. He called Montgomery an egotist, a man incapable of crediting anyone but himself. In his private diary, he described the press conference as theft of history, an attempt to rewrite an American victory as a British rescue. Eisenhower, trying desperately to hold the coalition together, drafted a letter to the combined chiefs of staff in which he admitted that unless Montgomery apologized, he would request his removal. The political fallout was immense. British leaders, alarmed by the possibility of a rupture, pressured Montgomery to make amends. Reluctantly, he wrote letters of apology to Eisenhower and Bradley, praising American troops and expressing regret. The words soothed the crisis, but did not heal the wound. The damage was permanent. For American commanders, the Ardennes proved the final confirmation of what they had long suspected. Montgomery would never view them as equals. Every success would be his alone. Every failure would be someone else's fault. His press conference had not only insulted them, it had revealed his true belief that the Americans, for all their numbers and power, still needed British guidance. Yet beneath the anger lay a deeper truth. The Battle of the Bulge was indeed one of the most desperate struggles of World War II. It tested not only soldiers' courage, but also the resilience of the alliance. For a moment, the unity of the coalition nearly collapsed under the weight of ego. But despite Montgomery's arrogance, the Allies endured. American and British troops continued to fight side by side. The war pressed on into Germany. The Ardennes had been Hitler's last card. When it failed, the Reich was doomed. But in the minds of American generals, another verdict had been written. Montgomery might be remembered in Britain as a hero, but in American memory, he would forever be the man who tried to claim their victory as his own. In the end, victory came not from one man's genius, but from the collective strength of a coalition that refused to break apart. The defeat of Nazi Germany was not the triumph of a single nation, but of many voices, many armies, and countless sacrifices. Yet within that unity lay scars that would never fully heal. For the Americans, Bernard Montgomery remained a reminder that even in a righteous cause, pride could wound as deeply as any enemy bullet. The story of Montgomery is not simply about military strategy. It is about the fragile nature of respect in war. It is about soldiers who ask not for glory, but for recognition that their blood was equal to that of their allies. It is about generals who fought not only on battlefields, but also in the halls of command where egos could alter the course of campaigns. World War II teaches us that alliances demand more than weapons. They demand humility, trust, and the willingness to honor one another's contributions. Without that respect, even the strongest coalition can falter. With it, nations can achieve the impossible. As we look back, we must remember that the victory of World War II was built not just on tanks and planes, but on the idea that freedom and justice are worth fighting for, together. And we must remember that the legacy of World War II is not only in the history books, but in the choices we make today, to eliminate fascism, to fight for peace, to fight for national independence, to fight for justice, and to fight for freedom. So, I leave you with this question. If respect could nearly unravel the alliance that defeated Hitler, what lessons must we carry into our own struggles for unity today?